Blood washes out of silk if you use cold water and salt. Naya learned that on her wedding night. She also learned that her husband's voice dropped an octave when he lied. People think being married to the mob means midnight shootouts and bags of cash on the kitchen counter. It doesn't. It means suffocating in expensive perfumes, pretending you don't notice the bruised knuckles slicing your steak, and listening the man in your bed plot your obsolescence. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, casting warped, watery shadows across the Persian runner. Naya walked softly. She had learned to walk softly in this house, trading her hard-soled boots for felt slippers that made her feel like a ghost haunting her own life. In her hands, she carried a silver tray holding a single crystal glass and a decanter of amber liquid. It was past midnight. Dante had been in his study since dinner, and she, playing the part of the dutiful, hopeful bride of 3 months, thought a peace offering might thaw the frost between them. The house smelled of beeswax stale ozone from the storm and the sharp, coppery tang of old money. She paused a few feet from the heavy mahogany doors of the study. They were cracked open just a sliver, letting a wedge of yellow light bleed into the dark corridor. She raised her hand to push the wood, the silver tray resting against her hip. Then she heard her own name. "Naya is trying too hard," a voice said. It wasn't Dante. It was Thomas, his underboss, a man who always smelled faintly of peppermint and gunpowder. "The staff is talking. She asked the chef for your mother's risotto recipe. She's nesting Dan." Naya's hand hovered in the air. Her chest tightened, a brief flutter of embarrassing hope catching in her throat. She had spent 3 hours in the kitchen that afternoon, burning her thumb on a hot skillet, just to get the broth right. She waited for Dante's voice. She waited for him to say he noticed, to say it was decent of her, to offer a crumb of the affection she had been desperately scraping for, since her father signed her away to settle a shipping debt. The ice clinked in a glass beyond the door. Dante's voice, when it came, was a low, resonant rumble. It lacked the performative warmth he used at dinner parties. It was flat, utilitarian. "Let her play house," Dante said. A match struck. The sudden scent of sulfur drifted through the crack in the door, followed by the heavy, cloying smell of a Cuban cigar. "You don't think it's a problem?" Thomas asked. "She looks at you like she expects a white picket fence at the end of this. You're leading her on." "I'm keeping her compliant," Dante corrected. The scrape of his leather chair against the hardwood floor sounded like a bone snapping in the quiet hallway. "She's a transaction, Tommy. Her father gave me the port access. I gave him his life. The girl was a necessary piece of the paperwork." Naya didn't gasp. She didn't drop the tray. Her body just stopped. The breath seized in her lungs. The silver edge of the tray pressed so hard into her hip bone it bruised, but she couldn't bring herself to loosen her grip. "Still," Thomas muttered. "Seems cruel. She's not a bad girl. I don't care if she's a saint." Dante exhaled a long stream of smoke escaping his lips. "I need an heir. That's the only reason she's in my bed. The commission is breathing down my neck about stability, and a son provides that. Once she gives me a boy, she can decorate the East Wing and rot there for all I care. I'll tolerate her presence until the line is secure. After that, she's invisible to me." Tolerate. The word dropped into Naya's stomach like a stone in a frozen pond. "Until she gives me a boy. Rot there. Invisible." She looked down at the decanter. The amber liquid sloshed, gently catching the light. She had spent the last 90 days twisting herself into knots, memorizing his moods, ironing his shirts when the maids were too busy lying beneath him in the dark, and convincing herself that his rough hands were a clumsy attempt at tenderness. She thought they were building something out of the wreckage of her arranged marriage. He was just waiting for her to become an incubator. A strange humming numbness started in her fingertips and crawled up her arms. She didn't feel the urge to cry. The tears she had shed over the last 3 months felt stupid now. Wasted water. Instead, a cold, heavy truth settled in the cavity of her chest, pushing out the naive girl who had walked down this hallway 30 seconds ago. Anyway, Dante's voice shifted the topic discarded as easily as a dirty napkin. "What's the word on the docks? Did the shipment clear customs?" Naya stepped backward. 1 step. Then another. She didn't make a sound. The felt slippers swallowed her retreat. She carried the heavy silver tray back to the kitchen, poured the expensive scotch down the stainless steel sink, and watched the amber swirl into the dark drain. She set the glass down. It made a sharp, final clack against the marble counter. When she walked up the sweeping staircase to their bedroom, the air felt thinner. She stripped off the silk robe she had bought because he once mentioned he liked the color blue. She shoved it into the back of her closet. She pulled on an oversized faded grey t-shirt she'd owned since high school, climbed into the massive empty bed, and stared at the ceiling until the rain stopped. Morning in the Russell estate usually followed a strict, suffocating script. Naya would wake up early, brush her hair until her scalp tingled, apply just enough makeup to look naturally flawless, and go downstairs to wait for Dante. She would pour his coffee. She would ask about his day. He would give her a monosyllabic answer, and she would smile, pretending the breadcrumbs were a feast. Today she woke up, looked at the silver-backed hairbrush on her vanity, and left it there. She didn't bother with the foundation or the mascara. She threw her hair into a messy knotted bun, pulled on a thick, unforgiving black turtleneck and slacks, and walked downstairs. The grand dining room felt cavernous. The mahogany table stretched out like a runway set for 2 at the far end. The scent of dark roast and sizzling bacon hung heavy in the air. Marian, the housekeeper, smiled warmly as Naya entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Russell. Can I get your plate?" "I'll serve myself, Marian." "Thank you," Naya said, her voice lacking its usual bright, forced cheer. She grabbed a piece of dry toast, poured herself a cup of black tea, and sat down. Not in the chair directly to the right of the head of the table where she usually sat to be close to Dante. She sat 3 chairs down. 10 minutes later, the heavy thud of Dante's footsteps echoed on the stairs. He entered the dining room like a weather front. He was a large man, built like a brick wall, poured into a bespoke charcoal suit. His dark hair was slicked back, his jaw sharp and dusted with a 5 o'clock shadow he purposely kept. He smelled of bergamot and expensive leather. He walked to the head of the table, pulling out his chair. He didn't look at her. "Morning." "Morning," Naya replied. Her voice was flat, utterly void of the upward lilt she usually used to coax him into conversation. Dante reached for the coffee pot. His hand hovered over it for a fraction of a second. Usually Naya poured it the moment he sat down. When she didn't move, he grabbed the handle himself, his dark eyes flickering to her over the rim of the silver pot. "You're sitting far away," he noted. It wasn't a question, but a statement of spatial fact. "The light is better over here." Naya lied smoothly, taking a bite of her dry toast. The crunch seemed obscenely loud in the quiet room. She didn't look at him. She stared at the financial section of the newspaper laid out on the table. The words were a blur, but she kept her eyes fixed on them. He poured his coffee, the dark liquid hitting the porcelain with a rhythmic splash. "You look different. I didn't sleep well." "You were asleep when I came to bed. I was pretending," she thought. "Just like you." "I was tired," she said aloud. She turned the page of the newspaper. The paper rustled aggressively. Dante took a sip of his coffee. He was a man trained to notice shifts in his environment. A misplaced pen, a nervous tick in a rival's eye, a slightly altered tone of voice. He was observing her now, the weight of his stare physically pressing against the side of her face. Naya focused on the texture of the linen napkin in her lap, rubbing the embroidered edge between her thumb and forefinger. "Marion said you asked for the risotto recipe yesterday," Dante said, casually slicing into a piece of bacon. Naya's stomach gave a sickening lurch, but her face remained a mask of polite indifference. The memory of his voice through the cracked door played in her head. Let her play house. "I did," Naya said, not looking up. "But I changed my mind. I told the chef to handle dinner from now on. I have other things to occupy my time. Such as, I'm going to redesign the garden." It was the first thing that popped into her head, but as she said it, she realized it was a brilliant excuse. It would keep her outside away from him, hands buried in dirt, instead of clinging to a ghost. Dante paused his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down. The silver clinked against the china. "The garden is fine." "The garden is dead," Naya corrected, finally raising her eyes to meet his. It was the first time she had really looked at him today. Her chest didn't flutter. There was no desperate yearning to smooth the line between his brows. She saw him for what he was, a cold, calculating businessman who viewed her body as a vessel to secure his legacy. His dark eyes narrowed slightly, a microscopic shift that betrayed his confusion. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to please him. For a long, stretched moment, they just stared at each other, across the mahogany expanse. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall grew deafening. "Do whatever you want with the yard," Dante said, finally picking up his fork again. His tone was dismissive, exactly as it had been last night. "Just don't make a mess of the patio. I have the Rossi brothers coming over for drinks on Thursday." "I'll be sure to stay out of your way," Naya said. She stood up, leaving her toast half-eaten. She didn't excuse herself. She didn't walk over to press a customary chaste kiss to his cheek. She just turned and walked out of the room. As she crossed the threshold, she felt the phantom heat of his gaze, burning a hole between her shoulder blades, but she didn't look back. She had a new role to play now. If he wanted a transaction, she would give him exactly what he paid for. Nothing more. 2 weeks passed. The house settled into a new suffocating rhythm. Naya stopped waiting up. She stopped making his coffee. She stopped asking about his day. When they passed in the hallway, she offered a polite nod, the kind one might give to a stranger in an elevator. In bed, when he reached for her in the dark, she didn't refuse him. She knew the terms of her contract, but she went still. She stopped arching into his touch, stopped whispering his name, stopped pretending it was making love. She stared at the shadows on the ceiling and waited for him to finish. Dante hated it. He never said a word, but she could feel the tension radiating off him in waves. He would grip her hips a little too tight, his breath hitching, as if he was waiting for a reaction that never came. When he rolled off her, the silence between them was thick, toxic, and entirely of his own making. She was just playing by the rules he wrote. On a Friday night, the illusion of their private war was forced onto a public stage. The annual syndicate gala was held in the ballroom of the Grand Hotel downtown. It was a glittering, venomous affair, where old men with blood on their hands drank champagne and discussed racketeering over caviar. Naya stood in front of her vanity mirror. She had chosen a dress that was armor. It was deep emerald silk, high-necked, long-sleeved, and completely backless. It was beautiful, expensive, and cold. She clipped a pair of heavy diamond drops to her ears. They felt like tiny, freezing weights pulling her down. Dante appeared in the reflection of the mirror. He stood in the doorway of her dressing room, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo. He looked lethal. The harsh overhead light caught the sharp angles of his face, casting deep shadows beneath his cheekbones. "You look—" He trailed off his eyes, sweeping over her reflection. He frowned. Usually she wore red. Usually she wore things that made her look soft, inviting. "Different. Is it inappropriate?" Naya asked, her voice, a flat, dead calm. She turned to face him, smoothing the silk over her hips. "No," he said, his jaw tightening. "It's fine. The car is waiting." The ride to the hotel was a study in silence. The leather seats of the Maybach squeaked softly as the car navigated the wet city streets. The neon lights blurred past the tinted windows, casting streaks of red and blue across Dante's rigid profile. He reached out, once his large hand moving across the center console toward her knee. Naya shifted, turning her body slightly toward the window to look at a passing storefront. His hand fell short, resting awkwardly on the leather beside her thigh. He slowly pulled it back. She didn't apologize. The ballroom was suffocating. The smell of roasted meats, heavy perfumes, and cigars mingled into a nauseating cloud. A string quartet played something classical in the corner, entirely drowned out by the roar of hushed threats and forced laughter. Dante kept a hand firmly on the small of Naya's back as they navigated the crowd. It wasn't an affectionate gesture. It was a branding. "Mine. Keep away." She played her part. She smiled with her teeth, not her eyes. She accepted compliments on her dress with a polite tilt of her head. But she didn't lean into Dante's side. She kept her spine rigid, a fraction of an inch of air constantly maintained between his hand and her bare skin. 2 hours into the agonizing night, Dante was cornered by a group of older dons from the west side. Naya, feigning a headache, slipped away toward the bar at the edge of the room. She ordered a club soda with lime and leaned against the marble counter, letting out a long, shaky breath. The noise was giving her a real headache. "A little lonely over here, isn't it, Mrs. Russell?" Naya turned. A man was leaning against the bar beside her. He was young, maybe 30, with slicked-back blonde hair and a suit that was too loud for the occasion. She recognized him, vaguely. Billy Vance. No, wait, Billy Donahue. A mid-level enforcer for a crew Dante despised. He smelled strongly of gin and cheap cologne. "I was enjoying the quiet," Naya said, coldly, turning her body away from him. Donahue laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. He took a step closer, crowding her space. The marble edge of the bar pressed into Naya's lower back. "Dan leaves his pretty new bird all alone. That's careless. If I had a wife looking like you, I'd keep her on a shorter leash." Naya's lip curled in disgust. "My husband doesn't need a leash, and you are standing entirely too close to me." Donahue's eyes dropped to the plunge of the dress at her back. He reached out his thick, clammy fingers, hovering inches from her bare spine. "You know, word is he only married you to settle a tab. Must be tough, knowing you're just a glorified receipt." The words hit her like a physical blow, a harsh, ugly echo of what she already knew. But coming from this sweating, grinning thug, it sent a spike of pure, unadulterated rage through her veins. She didn't get a chance to respond. A large hand clamped onto Donahue's shoulder. The force of the grip actually buckled the man's knees, dragging him backward. Dante stepped between them. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. But the sheer violence radiating from his rigid posture made the air around them drop 10 degrees. "Donahue," Dante said softly. His voice was a rasping whisper that cut through the noise of the ballroom like a straight razor. "If you ever look at my wife again, I will carve out your eyes and feed them to the stray dogs on Fifth Avenue. Do you understand me?" Donahue turned pale, the sweat beaded on his forehead. "Dan, hey, no disrespect, I was just... Get out." The enforcer scrambled away, nearly tripping over a waiter in his haste to leave the room. Dante turned to Naya. His chest was heaving slightly, his dark eyes blazing with a feral possessive fury. He grabbed her arm not gently and pulled her against his side. "Are you all right? Did he touch you?" Naya looked at the hand, gripping her bicep. His knuckles were white. He was breathing hard, the scent of bergamot, overpowered by the sharp, acidic tang of his anger. A month ago, she would have swooned. She would have seen a protector, a man deeply in love defending his bride's honor. Tonight, she saw right through it. He wasn't defending her. He was defending his property. He was protecting the incubator carrying his future legacy. Donahue hadn't insulted Naya. He had touched something that belonged to Dante Russell, and that was the only crime. Naya looked up into his fierce, burning eyes and felt absolutely nothing but a deep, hollow exhaustion. She calmly reached over and pried his fingers off her arm, one by one. "I'm fine, Dante," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "There's no need to make a scene over a receipt." She saw the exact moment the words registered. Dante froze. The fury in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden jarring shock. His hand dropped to his side. He stared at her, his mouth slightly parted, trying to decipher the absolute lack of emotion on her face. She didn't give him the chance. "I'd like to go home now," Naya said, turning her back on him and walking toward the coat check. She didn't wait to see if he followed. She knew he would. She was, after all, his most valuable investment. The ride back to the estate was a vacuum. Dante sat on his side of the leather bench, his frame rigid, his jaw working as if chewing on glass. Naya watched the raindrops trace jagged paths across the tinted window. The heater in the Maybach hummed, blowing dry, stale air over her ankles, but she couldn't stop the faint shivering in her shoulders. It wasn't fear. It was the adrenaline crash after a lifetime of biting her tongue. When the car pulled up to the circular driveway, Dante didn't wait for the driver to open the door. He shoved it open himself, stepping out into the drizzle. He didn't offer her a hand. He waited by the grand double doors of the house, hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching her climb the stone steps. Inside the foyer was silent, lit only by the low amber glow of the sconces. Marian and the rest of the staff were asleep. "What did you mean by that?" Dante asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it bounced off the marble floors, sharp and demanding. Naya unclasped her evening bag. She pulled out a makeup wipe, tearing the foil wrapper with a loud metallic rip. "By what?" "You know what." The receipt comment. He took a step toward her. The wet soles of his dress shoes squeaked against the stone. "Donahue is a loud-mouthed drunk. He says things to get a reaction. If you let street garbage like him get into your head—" "He didn't get into my head," Naya interrupted calmly. She scrubbed the wipe across her lips, smearing the expensive red lipstick, removing the mask. She tossed the soiled wipe onto the silver tray on the console table. It landed with a wet smack. "He just repeated what I already knew. Don't punish a man for having the same opinion as you, Dante. It's hypocritical." Dante froze. A muscle ticked rapidly high on his cheekbone. "What the hell are you talking about?" She looked at him. Really looked at him. He looked dangerous, broad looming, drenched in the expensive cologne that usually made her pulse jump. Tonight he just looked like a man standing in a hallway. "I'm tired," she said. She turned and walked up the sweeping staircase. She didn't go to the master suite at the end of the right hall. Instead, she turned left. Dante's heavy footsteps sounded on the stairs behind her, but he stopped at the landing. He watched as she opened the door to the third guest bedroom. It was a room usually reserved for visiting capos. It smelled of lemon-polish dust motes and utter disuse. "Naya?" His voice cracked like a whip. "What are you doing? I'm going to sleep." She didn't look back. "Your bedroom is down here." "Your bedroom is down there," she corrected softly. "I'm sure you can find your way. I'll have Marion move the rest of my clothes tomorrow while you're at the docks." She stepped inside and shut the heavy oak door. The latch clicked. It was a small sound, but in the cavernous, quiet house, it sounded like a vault ceiling shut. On the other side of the wood, Dante stood absolutely still for 3 full minutes. She tracked his presence by the faint shadow, blocking the light under the doorframe. He raised his hand. She heard the soft thud of his knuckles resting against the oak, as if he meant to push it open to demand she return to his bed, to enforce the contract her father had signed. But he didn't. The shadow shifted, the floorboards groaned, and his footsteps retreated down the hall. Naya sank against the back of the door and slid down until she sat on the cold, hard wood floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. Her hands were shaking violently. She squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her knuckles against her mouth to trap the ugly, jagged breath trying to claw its way out of her throat. She had drawn the line. Now she had to live on her side of it. By the 3rd week of the guest room arrangement, the atmosphere in the estate had curdled into something toxic. Dante was rarely home. When he was, he drank heavily. He stopped reading the financial papers at breakfast and started staring at the wall, a dark, brooding storm cloud, radiating aggressive energy. Naya avoided him like a professional. She spent her days in the sprawling, neglected garden at the back of the property. She didn't hire landscapers. She bought heavy canvas gloves, a pair of rusted shears, and dug her hands into the dirt. She tore out dead rose bushes by the roots, the thorns tearing through her gloves and leaving angry red scratches across her forearms. The physical pain was a relief. The smell of wet earth and crushed, rotting leaves grounded her. It was a Tuesday night, pushing 2 in the morning, when the silence broke. Naya was in the cavernous kitchen, wearing her faded grey t-shirt, pouring a glass of tap water. The storm outside was throwing violent flashes of lightning across the stainless steel appliances. The back door slammed open. Naya jumped the glass, slipping from her hand. It shattered in the sink, throwing wet, sharp diamonds of glass across the porcelain. Dante stumbled into the kitchen. He was not wearing his suit jacket. His white dress shirt was torn at the collar, and the entire left sleeve was soaked in dark, heavy blood. He was leaning heavily against the doorframe, his breath coming in shallow, ragged rasps. The smell of copper sweat and cheap whiskey hit the room instantly. "Don't move!" he gritted out, seeing the broken glass in the sink. He took a step forward and swayed. Naya didn't scream. 2 months ago, she would have rushed to him, weeping, frantic, pressing her hands to his chest. Tonight, she calmly stepped back from the sink, shook the water off her fingers, and walked toward the pantry where the first aid kit was kept. "Sit down before you ruin the tile," she said. Her voice was flat. Dante stared at her, his eyes glassy and dark. He gripped the edge of the marble island and lowered himself onto a bar stool, wincing as his weight shifted. Naya returned with a white plastic box. She set it on the counter. "Take off the shirt." He fumbled with the buttons with his right hand, his fingers slipping on the small plastic discs. He cursed under his breath. Naya watched him struggle for 5 seconds. Then she stepped into his space, batted his hand away, and undid the remaining buttons. Her knuckles brushed the hot, sweat-damp skin of his chest. He flinched, drawing in a sharp breath, but she didn't look up at his face. She peeled the ruined shirt off his shoulder. It was a knife wound, a deep, jagged slice across his left bicep. It was bleeding sluggishly, the edges of the skin, pale and angry. It's not an artery. She noted her tone, completely clinical. She opened a bottle of iodine. This is going to burn. She poured it directly onto the cut. Dante's jaw clamped shut with an audible crack. The muscles in his neck strained the veins bulging against his skin, but he didn't make a sound. His breathing hitched, coming faster. Naya took a clean gauze pad and began to wipe the excess blood away. She was efficient, cold. Her movements were precise, devoid of any lingering caress or trembling fear. It was a setup in the South End, Dante rasped, staring down at the top of her head as she worked. He was volunteering information. He never talked to her about business, never. Thomas got hit in the leg. We handled it, but... He trailed off. He was waiting for a reaction, a gasp, a question about his safety. Hold your arm still, Naya said. She grabbed a fresh roll of bandages and began wrapping it tightly around his bicep. Pulling the fabric taut, pinning the wound shut, Dante looked at her. Really looked at her. Her hair was a mess. There was dirt beneath her fingernails from the garden. She smelled like rain and basic soap, not the expensive vanilla perfume he had bought her in Paris. She felt like a stranger. You didn't ask if I was okay, he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough and confused. Naya taped the end of the bandage down. She picked up the ruined shirt with 2 fingers, dropped it into the trash can, and began packing away the supplies. You walked in. You're talking. You're fine. I could have died tonight. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It sounded like an accusation. Naya snapped the first aid box shut. She finally lifted her eyes to meet his. Her gaze was completely empty. There was no pity, no warmth, no fear. Just the dead, flat look of a cashier closing out a register. If you had died, she said smoothly, I assume Thomas or one of the lawyers would have called me in the morning to handle the paperwork. Dante flinched. It was a tiny movement, a sharp jerk of his chin, but it was the most genuine reaction she had ever seen him give. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the harsh fluorescent kitchen lights. She picked up the plastic box. Don't get the bandage wet for 24 hours. Good night, Dante. She walked out of the kitchen, leaving him sitting alone in the dark with the smell of his own blood and a broken glass in the sink. The breaking point arrived on a Thursday afternoon under the oppressive heat of a late July sun. Naya was in the garden, kneeling on a foam pad in the dirt. She was attacking the root system of a rotted hydrangea bush with a small iron trowel. Sweat dripped down the back of her neck, soaking the collar of her shirt. Her arms ached, covered in fresh scratches and smeared with mud. It felt good. It felt like progress. She heard the heavy crunch of gravel behind her. She didn't stop digging. She jammed the trowel into the dry earth, hit a thick root, and pulled hard. Stop, Dante's voice commanded. Naya ignored him. She wedged the iron deeper, her muscles burning as she leveraged her weight against the dead wood. A shadow fell over her. A large, calloused hand clamped around her wrist, hauling her arm upward and stopping the trowel mid-strike. Naya let go of the tool. She stood up slowly, brushing the loose dirt from her knees. She looked at the hand gripping her wrist, then slowly dragged her eyes up to his face. Dante looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with dark, bruised circles. His jaw was clenched so tight she could hear the grinding of his teeth. He was still wearing his suit trousers, but his shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the edge of the white bandage she had applied days ago. I said stop, he repeated, his chest heaving. What are you doing out here? You look like a vagrant. I'm redesigning the garden, Naya replied calmly. I told you that weeks ago. You're not redesigning anything, Naya. You're just destroying things. He dropped her wrist, dragging a hand through his dark hair. The scent of stale tobacco and anxiety rolled off him. You've been destroying things for a month. You don't talk to me. You don't look at me. You flinch if I walk into a room. I don't flinch. You freeze, he corrected sharply. Which is worse, you look at me like I'm a goddamn tax collector. Naya crossed her arms over her chest. Is there a problem with my behavior? Dante, have I embarrassed you in public? Have I failed to attend a function? Have I denied you your marital rights? The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but she forced them out evenly. Dante recoiled slightly. Don't talk like that. Like what accurately? What happened to you? He demanded, his voice, cracking the anger finally bleeding into something desperate. He took a step closer, crowding her against the ruined hydrangea bush. Where is my wife? Where is the girl who learned to make my mother's risotto, who ironed my shirts, who looked at me like I actually meant something? Naya stared at him. The sheer audacity of his grievance sent a cold, sharp thrill down her spine. He missed the worship. He missed the pathetic, eager-to-please girl who fed his ego. He didn't miss her. He just missed the mirror she used to hold up for him. She realized she was working too hard for a man who couldn't see her. Naya said, "What does that mean?" He grabbed her shoulders. His grip was entirely too tight, his fingers digging into her collarbones. Tell me what I did. Tell me what Donahue said to you. Whatever it is, I'll fix it. I'll buy you whatever you want. A trip to Milan. A new car. Just stop acting like you're dead. Naya looked down at his hands on her shoulders. She felt the phantom ache of the silver tray pressing into her hip. She smelled the sulfur of a struck match in a dark hallway. I don't want a car, Dante. She looked up, locking her eyes onto his. And you can't fix this. Why not? Because you're keeping me compliant, she said softly. The words dropped between them, heavy and exact. Dante's breathing stopped. His pupils dilated. The grip on her shoulders loosened a fraction of an inch, but he didn't let go. Naya didn't blink. She let him see the absolute icy void in her eyes. Because I am a transaction. My father gave you the port access, you gave him his life, and I was just a necessary piece of the paperwork. You don't care if I'm a saint. I'm just an incubator. Dante's mouth fell open. He looked like she had just driven the rusted iron trowel directly into his stomach. The blood rushed from his face, leaving a sickly grey pallor in its wake. He staggered backward, his hands falling limply to his sides. Naya. He breathed, the sound strangled and horrifyingly weak. I'm doing exactly what you wanted. Naya continued, her voice, gaining a terrible rhythmic momentum. She stepped toward him now, forcing him to back up another step into the dirt. I'm staying in the East Wing. I'm rotting here quietly, and I am tolerating your presence until the line is secure, although given our recent sleeping arrangements that might take longer than you planned. You heard me. He looked at her as if she were a ghost. His eyes darted around the garden, as if looking for the Thomas from 3 months ago, trying to rewrite the past. In the study. That night it rained. Blood washes out of silk if you use cold water, and salt, Naya said, a bizarre, humorless smile touching the corner of her lips. And your voice drops an octave when you lie. But you weren't lying that night, were you, Dante? You were just telling the truth to the wrong person. Naya, listen to me. You don't understand. That was talk. It was business. He was panicking now. The cold, calculated Mafia boss was scrambling his hands, reaching out to grab her again, grasping at thin air as she took a calculated step backward. The commission, they look for weakness. If they thought I was getting soft, getting attached to a bride I took for a debt, I don't care. The 3 words sliced through his frantic rambling like a guillotine. Dante fell silent. He stood in the middle of the ruined garden, looking utterly broken, the pieces of his own arrogance scattered around his feet. "I don't care about the commission," Naya said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I don't care about your image. I cared about you. And you killed that. You killed it before it even had a chance to breathe." She turned around. She picked up her heavy canvas gloves from the dirt, dusted them off against her jeans, and walked back towards the house. She left him standing there in the sweltering heat, surrounded by the dead roots he had asked her not to destroy. Dante did not come home for 3 days. The estate breathed a sigh of relief in his absence. The heavy, suffocating pressure that usually rolled off his shoulders and pressed into the corners of the ceiling dissipated, leaving behind a hollow, echoing quiet. Naya spent those days in the garden. She ripped out the remaining dead roots, turned the soil until it was dark and rich, and planted nothing. She liked the look of the empty waiting earth. It demanded nothing of her. When Dante finally returned, it was a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was baking the stone patio, radiating a dry, dusty heat. Naya was sitting at the wrought iron table, drinking iced water with lemon, reading a paperback she had found in the library. The heavy sliding glass door screeched on its track. Dante stepped out. He looked immaculate, which meant he had spent the last hour meticulously hiding the fact that he was falling apart. His dark suit was freshly pressed. His hair was slicked back, not a strand out of place, but the skin around his eyes was bruised with exhaustion, and the sharp lines of his jaw looked brittle, as if a single tap would shatter the bone. He walked over to the table and set down a velvet box. It was a deep royal blue. It landed on the metal grate of the table with a soft, expensive thud. Naya didn't mark her page. She didn't close the book. She just shifted her eyes from the printed text to the box, and then up to his face. "I bought it in the Diamond District this morning," Dante said. His voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual commanding resonance. It sounded like he had been swallowing sand. "It's a tennis bracelet, 5 carats, flawless." Naya stared at him. The sheer terrifying disconnect between the man standing in front of her and the reality of their situation made her chest ache with a bizarre, cynical pity. He was a mechanic trying to fix a shattered windshield with a wrench. He only had one set of tools, and he was completely baffled as to why they weren't working. "Do you want me to wear it while I rot in the East Wing?" she asked softly. "Or just when I'm being an incubator?" Dante flinched. He actually stepped back, his hand dropping to his side, as if the velvet box had burned him. "Stop, please. Stop quoting you. I told you," he began, his voice rising a frantic edge, bleeding into his tone. "I told you it was for Thomas. It was for the commission. Carmine and the other bosses, they look for leverage. A wife you care about is leverage. A transaction is just a transaction. I had to make them think you meant nothing to me, and you did a spectacular job," Naya said. She finally closed the book. The spine cracked sharply. "You convinced them. You convinced me. The only person who seems confused about the narrative is you. I was protecting you. You were protecting your port access." Naya pushed her chair back. The metal leg scraped horribly against the stone patio. She stood up. The heat radiating off the pavers warmed through the thin soles of her canvas sneakers. "If you wanted to protect me, you wouldn't have brought me into a house where you let your underboss mock my attempts to cook your dead mother's recipes." That hit him. The air rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. His eyes darted away, staring blindly at the freshly turned soil of the garden beds. "I fired Thomas," he said to the dirt. Naya paused. A strange, cold prickle washed over her arms, despite the blistering sun. Thomas was his right hand. They had grown up together. Firing an underboss wasn't a corporate restructuring. In their world, it was an invitation to a blood feud. "You did what? I stripped him of his territory and banished him to the Jersey operation," Dante muttered, finally looking back at her. His eyes were entirely black, dilated with a mixture of exhaustion and suppressed violence. "He disrespected you. He questioned my choices in my own home. I handled it." He looked at her, waiting. He was waiting for the absolution. He had sacrificed his oldest friend on the altar of her bruised pride, and now he wanted the reward. He wanted the soft, forgiving smile. He wanted her to touch his arm. Naya looked at the velvet box. Then she looked at the dark, hollowed-out spaces under Dante's eyes. "You didn't fire Thomas for disrespecting me," Naya said, her voice dropping to a flat, dead calm. "You fired him because looking at him reminded you of how stupid you were to leave the study door open." She picked up her book, picked up her glass of lemon water, and walked past him. She didn't look back to see if he opened the box. She left it sitting on the wrought-iron table, baking in the relentless afternoon sun. The heat wave broke 3 nights later, with a violent, booming thunderstorm. The sky cracked open over the city, dumping sheets of heavy grey water against the reinforced glass of the estate windows. Naya was awake. She rarely slept through the night anymore. The guest bed was too soft, the linens smelling faintly of lavender, instead of the sharp bergamot she had spent 3 months acclimating to. She lay on her back, watching the lightning cast jagged skeletal shadows across the plaster ceiling. Then she heard it. A crash. It wasn't thunder. It was the distinct, high-pitched shatter of breaking crystal, followed by a heavy, meaty thud. It came from the first floor. Naya threw off the covers. She didn't bother with a robe. She padded down the cold hardwood hallway in her oversized t-shirt, her bare feet making no sound on the stairs. The house was pitch black, the storm having knocked out the localized grid 20 minutes ago. She found him in the study. The heavy mahogany doors were wide open. Dante was on the floor. He was curled onto his side, his back pressed against the leather base of his heavy executive desk. The floor around him was covered in the wet, glittering shrapnel of a shattered Scotch decanter. The pungent smell of expensive alcohol filled the room, masking the scent of rain. He was gasping. It wasn't a cough. It was a terrifying, rattling intake of air that completely failed to fill his lungs. His hands were gripping his own chest, his fingers digging into the fabric of his dress shirt, as if trying to rip his ribcage open. Naya froze in the doorway. For one terrible, cynical second, she wondered if he had been poisoned, if a rival crew had finally bypassed security. But there was no blood. Only the violent, panicked shuddering of a man whose body was mutinying against him. She stepped over the threshold, her bare feet carefully navigating the slick, alcohol-soaked floor and the jagged shards of crystal. She knelt beside him. His eyes were squeezed shut. His face was grey, a sheen of cold sweat sticking his dark hair to his forehead. The veins in his neck stood out like thick blue cords. "Dante!" He didn't hear her. The rattling gasp came again, followed by a choked, pathetic whine that didn't sound human. Naya reached out. Her fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before she pressed her palm flat against the center of his chest. His heart was hammering so fast it felt like a bird trapped in a shoebox, vibrating violently against his ribs. It was a panic attack, a massive, catastrophic system failure. The man who ordered hits over scrambled eggs, who stared down federal prosecutors without blinking, was suffocating on the floor of his own office because the architecture of his life had finally buckled under the weight of his own hubris. "Dante, look at me," Naya ordered. She didn't use the soft, soothing tone she would have used a month ago. She used the sharp, authoritative bark she used on stray dogs digging in her garden. His eyes flew open. They were wild, unseeing, completely consumed by the terrifying illusion of his own death. He grabbed her wrist. His grip was bruising his thick fingers, digging into her bones with the desperate strength of a drowning man. "Can't breathe." He choked out, his jaw trembling. "Yes, you can. You're hyperventilating. You're drowning yourself." Naya moved her other hand, gripping the back of his neck. His skin was freezing cold and slick with sweat. "Look at my face. Not the ceiling. My face." He forced his eyes to lock onto hers. "Breathe in through your nose. Count to 4, she commanded. He tried. He dragged a ragged, shallow breath through his teeth. "Nose, Dante. Shut your mouth." He clamped his jaw shut. He pulled a sharp breath through his nostrils. His chest heaved against her palm. "Good, hold it." She counted the seconds out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. He let the air out in a shaky rush. They sat on the floor among the broken glass and spilled scotch for 20 minutes. The storm raged outside, throwing flashes of white light across Dante's pale face. Naya didn't move. She kept one hand on his chest, feeling the frantic vibrating rhythm of his heart slowly decelerate into a heavy, exhausted thump. She kept her other hand anchored on his neck. She didn't offer words of comfort. She didn't tell him it was going to be okay. She just provided the physical anchor his brain needed to realize he wasn't dying. When the attack finally broke, it left him entirely hollowed out. His grip on her wrist loosened his hand, falling limply to the floor. He let his head rest back against the leather of the desk. He closed his eyes, his breathing finally, even though incredibly slow. "I thought I was having a heart attack," he whispered into the dark room. "You weren't," Naya said. She pulled her hands back, wiping the clammy sweat from her palm onto the fabric of her t-shirt. She looked at his ruined, exhausted face. The absolute physical dominance he usually wielded over a room was completely gone. He looked like a normal, aging man who was terribly, terribly tired. "Why did you help me?" he asked, not opening his eyes. The question hung in the air, heavy with the smell of alcohol and ozone. Naya looked at the shards of crystal near her knee. "Because I'm not a monster, Dante," she said quietly. "Basic human decency doesn't require a contract. I wouldn't let a stray dog choke to death on my floor either." Dante flinched, the words landing like physical blows. He finally opened his eyes, turning his head to look at her. The arrogance was gone. The possessive fury was gone. There was only a bleak, devastating realization. He had wanted a transaction, and now he was realizing exactly how cold a transaction truly was. Naya stood up. She carefully picked her way back through the glass. "I'll have Marion clean this up in the morning. Try to sleep." She walked out of the study, leaving him exactly where she found him. The next morning, the estate smelled of bleach and ozone. Marion had been in the study before 7, sweeping away the physical evidence of Dante's collapse. By 9 o'clock, the sun was shining relentlessly, burning the dampness off the stone patio. Naya was in the kitchen pouring a cup of black tea when Dante's newly appointed underboss, a quiet older man named Silas, who never made eye contact, walked in. "Mr. Russell requests your presence in the study, ma'am," he said, staring firmly at the stainless steel refrigerator. Naya set her tea down. The ceramic clicked against the granite. "Tell him I'm busy." "He said to tell you." The man swallowed hard, clearly hating his role as messenger, "that it concerns your departure." Naya's hands stilled. A slow, heavy beat of silence passed between them. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, tossed it onto the counter, and walked past the man without a word. The mahogany doors to the study were open. Dante was sitting behind his heavy desk. He looked better than he had the night before, but the edges of his face were still drawn tight with exhaustion. The power dynamic in the room felt entirely different. For 3 months, this room had been his sanctuary, his throne room. Now it was just the place where he had choked on his own anxiety. He didn't tell her to sit. He pushed a thick manila folder across the smooth leather surface of the desk. "What is this?" Naya asked, stopping 3 feet from the edge of the wood. "It's a way out," Dante said. His voice was flat, resigned. It lacked the frantic desperation of the garden and the terrifying weakness of the night before. It was just business. Annulment papers. They state the marriage was never consummated. The church will buy it with enough of a donation. There's also a deed to a townhouse in Back Bay and a trust in your name that will clear $50,000 a month for the rest of your life. Naya stared at the folder. The yellow paper looked obscenely bright against the dark wood. "And my father's port access?" she asked. "Remains mine," Dante replied, leaning back in his chair. "But I won't kill him for the debt. We're square. You gave me 3 months. I'm paying you out." He was letting her go. The realization hit her not with a rush of euphoric freedom, but with a strange, heavy, complex knot of contradictory emotions. This was what she had wanted. This was the exit strategy. She could take the folder, pack her bags, and walk out into the July heat as a wealthy, independent woman. She wouldn't have to listen to his voice drop an octave when he lied. She wouldn't have to smell the gunpowder on his clothes. She looked at the folder. Then she looked at the man behind the desk. He was watching her carefully, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He was bracing himself for her to snatch the papers and run. He was preparing to be entirely alone in this massive, echoing house. Naya reached out. Her fingers brushed the edge of the manila folder. The paper was rough under her skin. If she left, she would be Naya again. The girl who was traded to settle a shipping dispute. The girl who got lucky and walked away with a severance package. She would go to cocktail parties in Back Bay, and people would whisper about her short, tragic stint as a Mafia bride. She would be a victim who escaped. But if she stayed, she looked around the study. She looked at the spot on the floor where she had held his violently shaking body the night before. She looked at the man who had fired his best friend just to try and appease her anger. She realized something terrifying and deeply cynical. She didn't want to be a victim who escaped. She wanted to be the woman who broke the boss. In the real world outside these gates, power was an illusion. Men like her father traded women like poker chips. But here inside this suffocating estate, the power dynamic had inverted. Dante Russell, the man who terrified the city, was entirely at her mercy. He had handed her the knife, and now he was offering her the door, just so he wouldn't have to wait for her to plunge it in. Naya picked up the folder. Dante's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring at the window. "Silas will have a car ready for you in an hour. You don't need to pack. I'll have Marion send your things." Naya didn't open the folder. She held it with both hands, positioned it over the heavy glass ashtray on his desk, and ripped it in half. The sound of tearing paper was incredibly loud in the quiet room. Dante's head snapped back around. His eyes widened in absolute shock. Naya put the torn halves together and ripped them again, tossing the confetti of legal documents and financial freedom into the ash. "I'm not leaving," she said. Dante stared at the ruined paper, then up at her face. "Naya, what are you doing? I'm giving you an out. I can't give you what you want. I can't undo what I said. I'm bleeding out here, trying to fix a mistake that can't be fixed. Take the money and go." "No." Naya rested her palms flat on his desk, leaning forward until she was entirely in his space. The scent of bergamot and leftover fear clung to him. "You don't get to buy your way out of your guilt, Dante. You bought me. You signed the paperwork. I am your wife. I don't want a ghost in my house. He rasped, his eyes searching hers frantically. You don't have a ghost. You have a partner. Naya's voice was hard, stripped of any lingering, naive romanticism. You wanted an incubator. You wanted a compliant girl to sit in the East Wing. That girl is dead. You killed her. She watched him swallow hard. He didn't interrupt. So here are the new terms, Naya said. I am the lady of this house. Silas reports to me on domestic matters. You do not patronize me. You do not lie to me. If you have a problem with the commission, you tell me, and we handle it. If you have a panic attack, you call me, and I will sit with you. But you will never, ever treat me like a transaction again. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, absolute whisper. Because if you do, I won't leave. I'll just stay here and make your life an absolute living hell. Do you understand me? Dante stared at her. The shock in his eyes slowly morphed into something else. It wasn't love. It was too raw, too battered to be love. It was profound, staggering respect. The kind of respect he reserved for men holding a gun to his head. He was looking at his equal, a woman forged in the crucible of his own arrogance. He didn't nod. He didn't offer a charming smile. He looked down at her hands, resting on his desk, then slowly reached out and placed his large, heavy palm over hers. The warmth of his skin seeped into her knuckles. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a seal on a new contract. I understand, he said. His voice was steady. It didn't drop an octave. Naya looked at his hand over hers. She didn't pull away. The estate around them was quiet. The storm finally passed, leaving behind a ruined, clear morning. They were standing in the wreckage of a fake marriage, holding the sharp, dangerous pieces of a real one. Good, Naya said. She pulled her hand out from under his, stood up straight and turned toward the door. I'm going back to the garden. Don't interrupt me until dinner.